Me and my 3 friends were in New York around Christmas time. We didn't finally decide to leave until about maybe 2 o'clock in the morning. We got on the first train that we could catch, and as expected, it was empty. We were pretty sobered up by then. Then there was a sudden commotion in the next car over. We had peeped through the glass in between the cars, and there were 2 hooded men, or maybe teenagers, standing obnoxiously close to a woman sitting in one of the seats who was screaming for help. I suggested that we go over and kick their asses, but as me and a buddy got a closer look, we saw they were armed with handguns. I pushed all my friends to get to the next car over, away from the armed men. I took a look back and saw one of the men pointing at us before starting to follow. We ran through at least 3 different cars with the men following us before the train finally stopped at the next station. We all booked it through the old station to the nearest place we could hide. I got separated from my friends, so I went to hide behind a garbage can. I could hear my chaser's shoes hitting the tiled floors, so I knew I had no time to find a better hiding spot. I peeked through the opening at the top of the bin. I could get a better look at them now. One was black, the other was Indian, and they were both really young looking. I was sure they were only trying to rob us until I heard one of them say, "If you find them, kill them." I hope you understand why I almost gave away my position in reaction to hearing this, with a gasp and almost pulling the garbage bin down with me as I returned to cover it. I consider it a miracle neither of them caught me. They left the area. I took notice that they didn't have their guns drawn at that moment. I ran in the opposite direction of the 2 and quickly caught my friends who were waving me over from behind a large pole. I took cover with them behind another pole not far from that one, and we waited for as long as we thought necessary. The big shock to the story, though, was when we caught a glimpse of the woman from the train, who we thought was being threatened by the 2 men, walking over in the direction of the men and then calling something along the lines of, "Where are they? Don't tell me you didn't get them." The 2 men reappeared from beyond a corner, walking over to the woman. The rest of what they said was too low to pick up on. They walked back down the stairs to the platforms and, as we could guess, waited for another train to run their trap again. At the very least, we called the police and reported what was going on, but I have no idea if they were ever caught. I come from a small town in Pennsylvania, and I've lived here all of my life. I'm 17 years old, and the time this story took place, I was around 14 years old. My memory around this is a little hazy because I don't like to talk about it, but I figured I'd let out any dark feelings I still get by it. It may not be considered a scary story, but to me, this was probably one of the most scariest things that I've ever been through. At the time this happened, I was an 8th grader in middle school. During the time, my mom worked at Panera Bread, and she had to work very early in the morning, so me and my sister would usually take the bus to school while my dad and my little brother, who was around 4 years old at the time, would stay home. This will be important later. It was like any other ordinary day. Me and my sister would get ready and leave at around 7:20 a.m. to walk to our bus stop. We lived in an apartment complex, and we would have to walk the 3 minutes to the front of the apartment because that's where the bus would pick us up. A little background information: me and my sister would meet up with our friends at the bus stop since we lived in the same apartment complex, and we would wait until the bus showed up. I would stay at the back with my friend, while my sister and her friend would be towards the front, 5 feet from the stop. So, like our usual routine, I had met up with my friend, Reed, and my sister would meet up with her friend, who I'll call Lelia. We waited for the bus to show up. Me and Reed would always see this boy, who I'll refer to as Scott. He was a year younger than us, and he would always run across the street to our bus stop to get a seat since we would be the first to be picked up. This was because by the time the bus driver would pick him up, he'd be the last person, and there would be no seats left for him to sit at. So he began to run across the street, and we were used to seeing him run across like that. Reed and I would always laugh at the way he ran, but wouldn't pay any more attention after he made it across. This will also be important. So, as we're waiting for the bus to arrive, me and my friend were talking, and there would be 5 other kids waiting for the bus at the front of the apartments as well. And like always, we see Scott across the street, waiting for the bus to arrive. A few minutes go by, and we see the yellow bus coming towards our stop. So everyone on our side begins to gather their belongings, and we begin to form a line as the bus gets closer. It begins to blink its lights, and the stop sign starts to come out at the side, as a sign for the other cars to stop. And for just a second, I begin to see Scott running across. I don't give it 2 thoughts since this was normal, and I began to hear the screeching noise coming from the opposite side of the road. It was like everything was going in slow motion during those couple of seconds, and I remember hearing the screeching noise become louder and louder. As I'm picking up my head to see what the noise was, I heard a big thump noise, and what I saw next will forever remain in my mind until this day. I hear a big thump noise, and I then see Scott flying in the air. I then see Scott hitting the ground so hard, and the noise was so loud as he then made an impact to the street. I remember hearing my friend Reed then scream at the top of her lungs, and I then quickly looked at the car, and I saw the driver inside. I remember seeing the bus driver quickly taking out his walkie-talkie attached to his radio as he was then saying all these codes into it. I then see Scott running around the bus and towards where our bus stop was, and he then had his arms wrapped around his stomach, and he was bleeding all around his head. He also had these cuts on his face, and he was crying wildly. During that moment, I was so horrified that I froze, and I was so scared to say anything. The driver then came out of the car and began to panic, then saying to Scott, "Oh my God, man, I'm so sorry. I never even saw you." I was looking down for 1 second, and then it just happened. But Scott was in so much pain, then he didn't even pay attention to him. Then this kid in my sister's grade ran up to him, then sang, "Hey, man, do you need an ambulance?" Scott was just crying, then shaking his head yes. The boy then took out his phone and called 911, telling the operator everything that happened. The driver then fell to the ground, took a cell phone out, and began to call someone. He then put it on speaker, and once the person picked up and said hello, he'd been sad, "Mom," to the kid, "So sorry." And he then began to break down in tears, and he just kept repeating that same line over and over again. The driver's mother had tried to calm him down, and then the driver just said, "Please forgive me, please. And even my car, it's a friend's car." Scott just stayed on the ground, lying there, as everyone watched him. The next thing I remember was that Scott always had his mother and brother take him to the bus stop, and they would always make sure he got on, but on this day, they never went with him to the bus stop. I then began to check on my sister, making sure she was okay. Her and her friends seemed a little shaken up, but they were okay. Reed's mom and sister were running up to us, and I remember hugging them. At that moment, I felt so alone and horrified. I began to cry hysterically, and my sister was just trying to comfort me. Something that I always regret was never telling my parents right away about what happened. I didn't want to wake and worry my dad, and I didn't want to get my mom in trouble for leaving early. I knew that she suffered from anxiety, so I didn't want to give her a panic attack, which she would get every once in a while. So, my sister and I just decided to wait there. I remember calling my friend, who I'll call Kara. I remember that her and her mom worked at the school next to ours, and I began to tell her everything that happened. I began to break down. They quickly alerted the front desk, and she calmed me down, telling me everything was going to be okay. I know some of you might be thinking, how was I able to call my friend but not my parents? But during that moment, I just felt the need to call Cindy because she was who I trusted at the time, and we're still friends to this day. About 20 minutes later, the ambulance arrived. They began to check Scott and treat him while he was lying on the ground, still crying and in pain. 10 minutes passed, and I began to come at ease. They started to place him on the stretcher. I remember seeing his mom and brother running with a paramedic towards him, and they had the most worried and horrified faces that I've ever seen. I began to feel so sad for them. Reed, my sister, and I thought it would be okay if we went to school just to try and take our minds off of everything that happened and all of the horror we witnessed 40 minutes ago. We were at our bus stop for almost an hour, and we still got picked up at the next stop and then immediately went to school. I remember the staff waiting there for us and separating the apartment complex bus stop kids, escorting us to the library. I won't go into too much detail, but they pretty much stated that we could stop by the counselor's office anytime during the school day, and if we wanted to leave school, we were able to. After that event, I didn't take the bus for 4 months and was dropped off. I didn't want to cross the street, and whenever I would hear a tire screech, I would always jump and begin to get a cold sweat. A few months later, I began to feel better and continued to live a normal life. After that, Scott didn't go to school until months later, until he was finally okay, towards the end of the year. Like I said, I know this wasn't the typical stalker story, but this was one horrific event that I went through, and I never want to go through it again. But remember to stay safe out there. I really hope many people don't ever have to witness what I and the other kids had to see that day. It was truly awful. I'm a student in Rome and I live about 2 hours away from it, so whenever I have to go there, I have to go by train. I do have my driver's license, but I prefer the train because I can study on the way there. Plus, in Italy, it's quite common for students to move by train to reach the cities where we study. So, this one day in question, I was waiting at the train station in Roma Tiburtina with my boyfriend for my train to come. This is one of those times where I would get on the train by myself because he had an extra lesson the following day, so he was just keeping me company. We both noticed a weird guy with a bike acting strange, like he was drunk or something, but we didn't pay much attention because the station is often full of drunk homeless people roaming around. Here's why he never lets me go alone to the station, especially at night. So, we sat and waited for my train, and when it finally arrived, I got up, kissed my boyfriend goodbye, and got on the train. I did notice the guy with the bike standing in line behind me to get on the train, but I honestly didn't give it that much thought. After all, lots of people took my same train, and there were often drunk people trying to board without a ticket. When I got on the train, it was packed. No matter how many carriages I passed, I couldn't find a seat, so I just sighed and decided to go sit by the train door. I don't know about other countries, but here in Italy, some trains have a little seat by the door that you can unfold. So, I unfolded one of those and sat there, taking out my history book and starting my long study session. About 5 minutes into my studying, I felt something on my cheek. It was a hand. I raised my gaze from my book, and there he was, the guy with the bike. I immediately jerked his hand away from my face and asked, who are you and what do you want? He simply just stood there smiling, so I asked again, who are you? He then looked me dead in the eyes, still with that creepy grin, and said, "I'm no one. I'm just a dude. Wanna have some fun?" I didn't even bother answering. I just started picking up my stuff to leave, but then he put his arm right in front of me, blocking my way into the carriage. So, I grabbed his wrist, dug my nails into it, and then jerked it away, freeing my passage to the much more crowded carriage where he couldn't do anything to me. I tried to look for the ticket inspector to get some help, but he just kept following me. One very kind man noticed the creep was following me, so he offered me a seat and told me to stay there while he went to look for the inspector. I sat down and waited. I honestly thought that I was safe, that he wouldn't try to do anything in front of so many people, but I was wrong. He started going back and forth along the corridor of the carriage, and every time he passed me, he would try to touch me. He would caress my shoulder or face or even try to go to my breasts, despite the fact that I kept jerking his hands away. Everybody just watched and said nothing, absolutely nothing, to help me. After a while, the man came back with the ticket inspector and the creep ran away in the opposite direction. The inspector came up to me, and I showed him a picture of the dude that I'd managed to take, telling him that he was following me and touching me. So, the inspector went after the creep and eventually caught him a few carriages forward. He then proceeded to call the police. The police came to the next station, and while waiting, the creep was placed near his bike by the door with the inspector constantly watching him. At the train station, 2 officers had to literally lift him out of the train because he was resisting, saying that we were friends and that I obviously liked his attention. But he got arrested anyway. And the worst part of all this, no one even dared to help me on that train when he was trying to touch me in front of everyone. There was even a woman who said I must have done something to turn him on. So, even though I was just a student minding my own business, just sitting there looking at my books, in her mind, I must have done something to turn him on. Still to this day, I can't believe I was the one being blamed for his creepy behavior. Seriously, what the? Hopefully, I don't dox myself by writing this, but I'm a graffiti artist, or as some might see it, a delinquent. I'm fine with either title. Point is, I like to spray paint, and I'm decent with a can in my hand. The tagging community is atrocious. People are unfriendly, and there's no respect between artists. Because of this, I've adopted a much more inconspicuous routine. I like tagging up quieter spots where my art likely won't be seen by other artists or the general public. Old train lines are usually a good bet since the train cars are endless, and new trains get decommissioned and left to rot on them all the time. My friend Paul likes to come with me when I tag up, even though he's not big into the whole thing himself. I welcome the company. Some people don't understand the importance of a good friend, and I think that's sad. Most of my other friends don't seem to respect my time or interests as much as he seems to. Paul and I found ourselves smoking on some nameless set of old tracks I found earlier that day on Google Maps. I'm not a big stoner myself, but he smokes a lot of weed, so I often indulge to match his vibe. It wasn't that late, maybe a little past 10 p.m. We finished a J and talked as we walked alongside the old rusty freight train. Oddly enough, there wasn't a single tag on the entire train. It must have been recently moved here. I thought excitedly that I'd get first dibs on such a good surface. I tossed Paul a can for him to mess around with, and I started doing my own thing. About 5 minutes later, I finished my first tag. I admired it for a bit before moving to the next car, then the next. About 15 minutes and 2 paint cans later, I had 3 decent tags up adjacent to one another, and I was pretty proud of myself for how they looked in combination with each other. Sorry in advance if this offends anyone, but I tend to discard my empty cans whenever they go dry. So, I flung them back the way we had come, enjoying the satisfying clattering sound a ball bearing makes when bouncing around the inside of an empty can. I then caught up with Paul, who had seemingly rolled and lit another joint, neglecting the paint I had given him. For context, the reason I'm not a big stoner is because I started getting unbearable anxiety highs much more frequently, maybe 90% of the time. In hindsight, smoking 2 Js with Paul was a borderline detrimental decision. After all, we were doing something illegal, which was already pretty anxiety-inducing. I smoked the second joint anyway, confident that I'd be okay. As soon as the final sparks floated off the J, that's when we heard it. A muffled clang from somewhere behind us rang out into the night. The two of us froze and stared into the darkness. I could feel droplets of sweat forming around my neck as adrenaline began coursing through me. I couldn't tell if the sound had come from outside of the train or from inside one of the cars. It was hard to tell which option was worse. We waited for a full minute in silence, and nothing. That's when I whipped out my phone and recorded this video. Bro, what the was this? No way, bro. You heard that? I heard that. What the, boy? Whoever made that noise picked up one of my empty paint cans and threw it at us before chasing and shouting at us. You can't really see the paint can in the video, but I swear to you that's what the first sound was. As we frantically made our escape, whoever was behind us yelled, "You better not trip, boy." A few seconds later, an actual gunshot sounded off behind us, almost causing Paul to trip and fall. It startled me so much that my finger slipped off the record button on Snapchat, and the video cut out. We bolted down the tracks until they intersected a main road and didn't stop running until we were a safe distance away. I don't think I've ever been more terrified in my entire life. It didn't help that I was stoned out of my mind. My hands were literally shaking, and so were Paul's. We found our way back to the car and drove home in silence. What was I supposed to do? Call the police? I was literally breaking the law. That wasn't an option. The story doesn't end there, though. I actually went back to those tracks a few weeks later, but this time during the day and equipped with my trusty Glock 17. To my surprise, the train was still there. Despite that, there was a pretty glaring difference this time around. In the 3 spots where my tags had previously been were now ugly blotches of red paint. Someone had deliberately covered my work. Quietly, I kept investigating and eventually came to a train car with its door wide open. I took a look inside, and it was bizarre. The train car was completely empty except for a chair in the direct center and what looked like ropes and chains scattered about. Some of the ropes were wrapped around the legs of the chair, and others were just lying on the floor. The weirdest part was the smell, though. The whole car smelled like bleach. If you closed your eyes, you would have guessed you were in a cleaning supply closet. I can't overstate the smell, though. It literally smelled like the whole train car had been doused in bleach. I went to take a picture of the scene when I thought I heard a metal clang somewhere further down the train. I could have imagined it, but I wasn't taking any chances. That was enough for me. I was out of there as quickly as I had come. I've told so many people this story, and none of them could rationalize that psycho's actions in a way that makes sense. I doubt a homeless person would be able to get their hands on a gun, but I can't fathom why someone other than a homeless person would respond so aggressively. And why they decided to cover up my tags is another mystery. I think the most disturbing aspect of this whole thing was the chair in the middle of the train car. I really want to go back to those tracks just to take a picture of what I saw, but I haven't worked up the courage to. I have no idea if whoever was there that night was really shooting to kill us or just trying to scare us, but sometimes late at night, when it's just me and my thoughts, I can still hear that shot ringing in my ears. My name is Valor. I'm 24 years old, and this was the most horrifying experience of my life. I live and work in New York City, but I don't have a car, so my main mode of transportation is the subway. It was a Saturday night. I was on my way home from a party in the middle of the night. I did this about every other weekend, so I was completely fine with taking the subway alone at night. Walking down the steps, entering the underground without a soul in sight, it was always a bit chilling. This specific station was very tightly spaced. As I was walking, I could almost feel as if I were being watched or followed, along with the occasional echoing bang-type sound emitting from an unknown location. I was early for the train, so I sat on a bench and waited. This is something straight out of a horror movie. I heard this exact phrase, "Over here, buddy." There was somebody standing on the tracks inside the tunnel, poking his head out and looking at me. It was a filthy-looking man, I'd say in his early 40s. He gave me a smile, a horrible yellow smile with at least 3 teeth missing, and I could tell that even from where I was sitting. I did the best I could to pay no attention to him, but he wouldn't go away. There was laughing coming from inside the tunnel, and then another disgusting-looking man stuck his face out as well. This man gave me a nasty smile as well before telling me to come hang out with them in the tunnel. The way they stared at me, though, their eyes wouldn't even move, it's as if their sight was locked onto me. I resumed doing the best I could to ignore them and just wait for the train. I noticed in my peripheral vision that one of the men moved away into the tunnel, returning moments later with another face. I had to look again. There was a third face, but this one was hunched over and lifeless. It looked like one of the men was holding the guy's face up. The sound of the train approaching felt like 1,000 pounds off my shoulders. I got up, ready to board the train, but when I got closer to the edge of the platform, I nearly threw up at the sight. The 2 men were going back into the tunnel, and the second man in the back was holding something in his hand, a head, just a head, like a decapitated head. They disappeared from sight onto the side of the tunnel as the train stopped. I got into the first car, planning on warning the conductor, but no later than after we left the station. I didn't want to be there a second longer. As the train began to move, I saw legs moving down the stairs to the platform, but that was it. I didn't get to see who it was. But what I did get to see as the train moved into the tunnels was a glimpse of a group of men hunched up against the railing, inches away from the train window, and they were all looking right at me. I knocked on the conductor's door like a madman, screaming it was an emergency. He opened up, and I explained what I just saw. He radioed to somebody in charge of the station as well as another higher up of the company, who I'm sure took care of it or contacted the proper authorities or security, whatever. It seemed to take ages for my stop to come, but when it did, I practically had to hop in my walk from relief. I have since been to one party at the same friend's house, but I skipped that station. I decided it was worth it to take the extra long walk to the next station. I don't know if weird shit happens often in the subway at night. In my experience prior to this incident, it never did. But after this experience, I think I should say you should be extremely cautious when in an isolated place like a subway station late at night. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to watch the latest videos.